Hello and thanks for stopping in. This time we're going to be building this Tamiya CC-02 Unimog. Step 1. Step 1's charging the battery. Step 2. The gearbox. So they're not going to be gentle with us, huh? Oh, hang on. If you want low ratio, do it like this. I want low ratio. We're still on step 1 and I'm afraid I'm already in difficulties. I've done this one, which is this, and I've done this one, which is this, and I've set it up for the low gearing ratio. However, I can find this shaft here, this pinion here, I've got my bearings, but I need this 8mm long pin here, and I just cannot find it anywhere. I can see two 10mm long pins in here, but nothing 8mm long, and in fact my abiding memory of my recent MO5 build is of me searching in confusion through loads and loads of small unlabelled bags like this. Everyone praises Tamiya and says that they make it impossible to go wrong, but I'm stuck on stage 1. I don't know what that says about me. However, time is marching on and I want to get this gearbox closed up before my wife gets home from work, so I'm going to cut an 8mm shaft from the shank of this 2mm drill bit. There, now we can carry on. Problem solved. Everything spins freely. I think we're ready to put this bit on and close it up like that. The gearbox is indeed closed up, and I hope you could see that if I turn the output shaft a little bit, the black motor shaft turns a lot. So there's our extreme reduction ratio. I'm glad about that. I've bought a crawler motor as well. I must report that while looking for a 10mm shaft, I found an 8mm long one, the one I made out of a drill bit. So Tamiya did include it. That 10mm long shaft was to retain the spur gear. Next is its cover. And that's the gearbox closed up. When it comes to the tricky business of setting the motor's pinion at the correct distance along the shaft, you're advised to use a caliper, and that is the wisest course. I can't find mine, however, and used the old trick of using an appropriately sized open-ended spanner, which worked perfectly for me. I should just briefly point out that this isn't the silver can motor provided by Tamiya, which has 27 turns. This is a 45 turn crawler motor. Here you can see me using a tiny portion of an electricity bill to correctly set the lash or clearance between the drive pinion and the spur gear. Once I had installed the motor and carefully set the clearance between the pinion and the spur gear, I realised to my horror that I'd actually forgotten to Loctite the grub screw that retains it. However, fortunately there's access, and I was able to do it without removing the motor and having to set the lash all over again. So I think it's time to give this a test. Oh, that's excellent. Nice and quiet. Next, it's time to move on to assembling the chassis. I'm slowly learning the Tamiya way. Like making sure I've got everything before I start. This is this. Now I have to move on and do this. At the end of step 8, we've reached this point. Let's move on to step 9. Main chassis rails. Excellent. Well, that's gratifying. Now to move on to the front subframe. That's the end of step 10. I've created this thing. For the next stage it wants me to make a decision. Specifically, do I want to mount my servo upright? Well, I don't know. How am I supposed to know that? What are the pros and cons of horizontal and upright on this particular truck? I don't know. I've just finished stage 13. And this is the state of play. Step 14 was installing the motor and gearbox. And 15 is what in England we call the prop shafts, and in America are the drive shafts. I'm slightly surprised to see that Tamiya has gone with the British nomenclature and calls them propeller shafts. But whatever we're calling them, they're assembled and fitted. Step 17 calls for the fitment of these mounts for the links. As you can see, I've just done that, and also on goes F8. I don't know what F8 does, but I'm sure it's important. One thing about Tamiya, with other brands it might not be surprising if you had to manipulate F8 a little bit, stretch it or bend it or flex it a tiny bit to get the holes to line up. Not with Tamiya. Every single hole lines up perfectly with every other, to the point where you stop being surprised each time it happens. The next stage is to move on to the diffs. However, if you want to build the diffs in a locked state, there's a different set of instructions. Now, most builds I've watched of the CC02 have been done with the rear diff locked but the front left open. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to build it with both diffs locked. Bad news! Rear differential can be locked for running on slippery surfaces. They don't provide the wherewithal to lock the front diff. Right then, we're going to have an open front diff. That's a great pity. Now that I've accepted that I can't build this truck with a locked front diff, I'm going to build the front open diff, and then I'll move on to building the rear one, which of course I will be building locked. Here's the open diff. Spins nicely. I'm about to fit the cover. Okay, front diff. Let's move on to the locked rear one. You know what? Looking at the parts I have here, I think they have actually given me enough parts to enable me to take that front diff apart and assemble it as a locked diff. And I'm very tempted to at least try. Well, I feel like a rebel now. Both diffs are locked. And next, it's the drive shafts. This is the front, being illicitly built against Tamiya's instructions with a locked diff. Okay, I'm going to turn one end of this. Right, that just needs grease now, and I can close it up. The front axle's complete. You can see as I turn the input, we're getting drive. Here's the front axle once I've attached these various brackets for links and these two little ball ends. It's worth noting that at this point these can be withdrawn and then they get disengaged from the diff. So you have to handle this with care until the knuckles are on, and they should hold it all in place. In step 22, we'll be assembling those steering knuckles and fitting them to the axle. Before you fit this screw here, it helps if you pre-thread the component by screwing one of the screws in and out of each hole before you start. Then put it all together and put your screws in. It does make things a great deal easier. I just want to see how well this axle does now that it's fully assembled. That's lovely and smooth. Wonderful! The last thing you have to do to the front axle is to attach half the front prop. And as you can see, I've done that too. So the front axle's finished and it's time to move on to the rear. I've got the parts ready to do the rear axle, and here's the rear axle. Excellent progress. Time to fit these axles to the chassis. Both axles are fitted. Good articulation. Let's see what's next. Next, of course, is the construction of the shock absorbers. When you build the shocks, you just shove a couple of O-rings in there, having lubed them up, screw that cap on, and then lube up this shaft, poke it through and hold it steady while you screw this thing on. Now, I watched Phil from Tom Lee RC build some shocks before attempting to do this myself, and the two lessons that I learned from watching the Phil were: grip the shaft firmly and use plenty of lube. So with Phil's advice ringing in my ears, I've done that. I've built my shocks, and now it's time for me to fill them with oil, insert the diaphragm and fit the other end cap. Well, I've done one and it's not leaking. I didn't think I'd have much to say about building shock absorbers because I'm no expert, but in fact while doing this one I did make a little discovery which I'd like to share with you now. The manufacturers don't make the piston a tight fit in the bore. It's the gap all the way around the piston through which the fluid flows, which gives us our damping. So if, having filled it with fluid, when we're trying to purge it of air, we lean it to one side and kind of wiggle the piston like that so that it touches here and clears all the way round, you get the air out a lot more quickly than if you hold it vertically, as Tamiya suggests. But I will show you what I mean. So the piston's right at the bottom at the moment. Fill this thing up with fluid. Pick it up so you can see what's going on. If I tilt it, I'm going to slowly move the piston up. Obviously as the air comes out, the level drops and I have to compensate. If I overfill it, I can't lean it very far, but leaning it and displacing the piston to one side was so effective that there's no more coming out. I'll now leave this for about half an hour and I'm sure a few more tiny bubbles will work their way to the surface and escape. Then I'll fit the diaphragm and screw the top on. But as you can see, in one glorious orgy of purging, we got nearly all the air out in that very first attempt. 20 minutes later, on goes the diaphragm, which causes some spillage, and on goes the end cap. After that, it's just a question of adding one of these plastic clips here There does seem to be a right way round and a wrong way round to get the spring. So you can press the spring and then add this clip, and you've got a hydraulically damped Tamiya shock absorber. And now I have to fit the shocks. It's not difficult to do, but it is difficult to record. I have to put this loop onto this ball joint and then put a bolt through at the top. The lower end is on. I've got this bolt with a sleeve on it. That goes into the shock. That goes into the rearmost mounting hole on the shock tower, and then it's just a question of fitting and doing up a nut. And with that, the front shocks are fitted. Excellent. So, all 4 shocks are fitted. That is a bit of an important moment in the build. We should celebrate. Well, I suppose I better get back to the build. The next thing the good folks at Tamiya tell you to do is to sort out your radio. So I scampered off to get the big servo I knew I had. And it's not big enough. It doesn't really fit. I'll show you. The servo isn't long enough from here to here. I could probably live with that by making little extension brackets. But also, the distance between this hole and this hole is too small as well. So out of the 4 holes in the servo, only 1 lines up. I'm sure I could make it fit by making an adapter plate, but it strikes me that it probably wouldn't be torquey enough. So I turned to my phone, went to Amazon, and I've ordered another servo which is arriving tomorrow. So while I wait for the steering servo to arrive, I'm going to bolt on these 2 flanges on the side and add the receiver box to the chassis. And with that done, I can give the wheels a coat of paint. I've painted the wheels to look rusted. And while I'm waiting for the steering servo, I think I'll have a look at the tyres. In fact, just give me a moment with these, would you? Oh yeah, this is good rubber. Despite the delightful smell, those tyres are of quite a firm compound. Let's get some mounted onto the rims and we'll see what they're like. Well, this is certainly a very scale and good looking wheel and tyre combination, but I'm a bit surprised at the hard compound Tamiya have used for these tyres. These are not crawler tyres. Still, they're going to look great on the vehicle. Servo's here. Let's see if it's bigger than the other one. Well, luckily this time it did turn out to be the right size. I've installed it, I've plugged it in, and I've fitted the wheels. I'm in a bit of a strange situation here. Because this truck was a gift from the RC Elf, I find myself strangely disinclined to say anything negative at all about it. However, I feel duty bound to say this: that is not a crawler ESC, and I have no idea why Tamiya included the TBL 004 with this kit. I may have to swap out to a crawler ESC in the future, but for now, let's test it. With the build complete, that's the end of this video. It's got long enough already. But next time I'll be painting the body and we'll take it for a run. So if you'd like to see that, please do join me.